Welcome to the Articles of Confederation, 1781 to 1789. You are looking at an aerial view of Independence Mall, and of course at the end of it, the historic Independence Hall. So again, as we know from class, a mall is a walking space. And so Independence Mall, Washington Mall, these were simply walking spaces. There's no shopping to be done here today. We have shopping malls. But at the end of Independence Mall, the historic Independence Hall, where we had the Declaration of Independence, the Second Continental Congress, the selection of George Washington as the commander-in-chief, ultimately the Articles of Confederation, and later the Constitutional Convention. Looking at the rest of Philadelphia here, what's visible, because there's many other historical places along this mall that aren't visible in the image. You can see the Liberty Bell Museum at the bottom that has a clear window view out on the hall. You can also see the Second Bank of the United States right here. That's not a big deal for us right now, but it's later going to become an issue as we get to Andrew Jackson and some of these later presidents. Additionally, in the trees back here, there is another building. Again, it's small. We can't really see it, and that's Carpenter's Hall, where the First Continental Congress met. And so Philadelphia, Pennsylvania, again, in this area, First Continental Congress at Carpenter's Hall, and then later the Second Continental Congress with some of those events that we talked about. So in discussing how to structure and set up a government, the Articles of Confederation had certain concerns about how to do this. Number one, as with anything in life, they had the experience that they had lived, and that was their biggest influence. And so when we look at issues of power today, they show up in our movies. And so one of those movies, quite obviously, that we've been dealing with recently has been Infinity War with the Avengers. And as we know, Thanos, the bad guy, is seeking to get all the power to himself. In Lord of the Rings, a similarly huge film from a good decade and a half earlier, Sauron, the bad guy in it, was seeking to get all the power to himself in the form of the ring. So we have other movies that deal with this. Batman versus Superman. And maybe I like this movie a little bit more than I should, but in Batman versus Superman, Batman comes to distrust Superman because Superman has virtually unlimited power. Additionally, you have Lex Luthor trying to get a kryptonite weapons smuggled in to be able to use against Superman if something, God forbid, Superman's character changes and he goes bad. And so this distrust of Superman's absolute power is the basis of that movie. And so similarly, when we structure government, we have this sensitivity about how to structure and set up power. Our experience with England had been instructive. We had had this time away from England, 3,000 to 4,000 miles away, depending on how you measure it, to develop our forms of representative government. Meanwhile, back in England would later reassert control. They would end the policy of salutary neglect, and the king, and with him also Parliament, would begin to exert this control over the colonies that the colonists would not like. And as the colonists thought about how to set up a government, again, they had to be concerned with this distribution, how to spread the power so that it doesn't ultimately end up in the hands of one branch of government, of one person within government. And so we have classic constitutional principles like the separation of powers, which begin at the central level, otherwise known as the national or the federal level. And so the branches within the separation of powers are the executive branch, the legislative branch, and the judicial branch. Federalism, meanwhile, concerns itself with the division of power between the national and the state governments. And so these are some of the ways that they'll break the power up. And so when considering all this, again, the colonists, once they have their independence from England, They really don't want to have this experience all over again of having a king, of having a central, strong leadership role. They want to give power to the states, which is more their local governments. And so the Articles of Confederation will give virtually all power to the states, as we will talk about. And it's here in the Articles. Again, we can see the Articles over on the right. We are used to seeing the Declaration of Independence, the Constitution, as parchment documents, parchment being the skin of a dead animal. But here we're looking at the actual Articles of Confederation, which we don't see as much. And it begins with "to all whom." And so you can see some of the language that's involved in the Articles, a firm league of friendship. In other words, this is a friendship. There's not a lot of have to or you have to do this. And meanwhile, the states, the language is they keep their sovereignty, it's their power, they keep their freedom and independence. And so, again, emphasis upon the state. Okay, the structure of this government. Again, at the national level, the power is in the hands of the states, but also there is a lack of an executive and judicial branch. There's no real president. Now, I mentioned to you guys that the first president was a guy named John Hanson, but the presidency, at least as John Hanson and other people would have it under the Articles, wasn't anything like the presidency that we have today. It was largely powerless, and it was simply the president over the legislative branch. And so I throw that out there to get you thinking about how we structure government. They structured government under the Articles very differently than what we have now. The Articles did have some strengths. They could declare war and make peace. They could also print and borrow money. And you'll find out that during the Revolution, they printed a lot of money. And when you just simply print money, it tends to devalue it. And so the currency of the Continental Congress became nearly worthless at some point. They could also deal with foreign countries and sign treaties. And this became very important as they dealt with France, Spain, and the Netherlands, who would help us out. Operation of post office, selling land, and governing the nation's western territories. The Northwest Ordinance, which we'll spend more time with in a moment. And so, although there are some strengths, more significant are the weaknesses of the Articles. They couldn't regulate trade between states, and you have states that are wanting to go to war with one another. Because, hey, we sent this shipment over and New York is taxing us too heavily. And then this state's upset with this state, and they're talking about going to war with one another. It has no power to tax. A government that doesn't have the power to tax doesn't have money. A government without money doesn't have power. It has no power to enforce laws. Everything it does is dependent upon the states, be it for money, be it for troops, and all of these the states could deny, and they frequently did. Each state had only one vote. Regardless of population, they were all equals. And they could not pass laws without 9 out of the 13 states approving. To amend the Articles, meanwhile, it took a unanimous vote, 13 out of 13 states, to essentially amend the Articles. Okay. One of the successes of the Articles is that it was the government under which we defeated Great Britain. However, we need to be very careful what we say about this. America defeats Great Britain under the Articles, and they made some good decisions in terms of foreign policy and getting some things done. But they could never raise taxes. They could never pay off the troops. Washington's troops are always leaving. At the end of the war, they're still unpaid, many of them. And so these are huge problems that the Articles creates by being too weak. It's kind of equally fair to say that America wins despite the Articles of Confederation, that we win even though we have this government. But nevertheless, it's like a coach. If you coach a team, maybe you do a bad job, but you still get the win. The Articles of Confederation gets the win in the win column. And so this is a success, but it's not a success that maybe it deserves. The Northwest Ordinance, meanwhile, represents the greatest achievement of the Articles of Confederation. The Northwest Ordinance was an attempt to determine how to settle westward lands. And so you have back then what was the Wild West. Ohio was the Wild West at this time. Indiana, Illinois, Michigan, Wisconsin. And so the Northwest Territory sets up this breakdown of how we will take control of these lands and eventually turn them into states. This is something that we still follow to this day. Very interesting as they break it down here. As they break it down into sections, they even reserve some of these places for public schools. And so it's under this Northwest Ordinance that, again, even after the Articles die, the Northwest Ordinance will survive and becomes our continued pattern for the admission of new states. If we admit Puerto Rico as a new state tomorrow, it will be partly under what we had with the Northwest Ordinance. And so all of this with the Northwest Ordinance becomes this aid in helping American westward expansion, that ultimate goal of manifest destiny about going all the way to the Pacific Ocean. And the final event of the Articles, all the weaknesses that are so apparent in the Articles finally come to a head under Daniel Shays. And so Shays is a former Continental Army veteran, and he and 4,000 men under his leadership who have not been paid by the Continental Congress as a result of the war and due to other economic issues, their debts are being called in, they're told they're going to lose their land, they're outraged, and they basically take up arms and go to Springfield, Massachusetts. And the Articles government does not do a whole lot because it can't. They can't finance troops. They can't send people to end the rebellion. Instead, the states do this, but the delay is scary. And so when the delay happens, it scares the nation enough to make a change. Ultimately, this will lead to the Constitutional Convention of 1787. And so it's thanks to Shays' Rebellion and thanks to the many other weaknesses which had shown themselves over the years, that after essentially 6 years of being a government, they're immediately going, hey, we have to scrap this thing and start over. And so this is, again, what leads us to the Constitutional Convention in 1787.